Well, hello everybody. My name is Jordan. If we haven't yet had the chance to meet, I am the digital discipleship pastor here at Faith Chapel, which means that no matter where you're joining from, whether you're in person or online, part of my role is to help you follow Jesus, be transformed by Jesus, and be on mission with Jesus. So just glad that you're joining us here in person and online. I want to say a special welcome, whether you're in a coffee shop, maybe you're in your living room, or maybe you're listening on a drive or on the podcast. We're just really glad that you would join us. As a special part of this weekend, we're going to do something a little bit different. And if you want to online, I hope you would join the discussion by going to faithchapel.cc/chat, and there's a host there who would love to meet you, talk with you, and pray with you if you need anything. But even in person today, if you want to, after the message, I'm going to go side stage and I'm going to join the chat. If you have questions as we go through today's message, please feel free to put them in the chat. You don't have to, but online, if you have questions, or in person, if you have questions, you can throw them in there, and I'll jump side stage afterwards, and I'll do my best. Either I'll have an answer or I'll tell you about somebody who's way smarter than me that might be able to help. So no promises there. Well, this weekend, we're continuing in our series Threads. We're on empires, kingdoms, and realms. Last week, Nate talked about judges and kings, and this week, we're talking about prophets. And prophets are a unique role that we see all throughout Scripture. It's mentioned over 200 times in the Bible, and it's a huge, huge topic. And in fact, I want to give you a disclaimer that we're not going to get through all of it today. There's so much to cover. This message today is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to prophets and their roles and all those things. But I would hope that as we go through this, that you would get a greater picture of what role they played, and also a glimpse of the picture of Jesus and who he is as we cover that today. Before we dive in, there's a couple things that we need to clarify about this topic before we dive in. The first would be, what is a prophet? And I don't know about you, but when I initially hear the word prophet, there's a picture that comes into my head. And the first thing I would picture is somebody that looks maybe a little bit like Gandalf or Dumbledore. And maybe they've got those really thin spectacles. Maybe they've got a long beard, a nice flowing robe, probably gray. And a staff, and they have this mystical ability to just look into the future and say what's going to happen. And that's not quite what we're talking about when we're talking about biblical prophets. In fact, one of the prophets we're talking about today, Moses, he was a shepherd before he became a prophet. And so throughout all the different prophets, they didn't have any specific qualifications that it meant, but they did have some distinct roles that they filled as prophets. And the first role that prophets filled throughout the story of the Bible is that prophets would call people back to God's covenant. Prophets call people back to God's covenant. And we'll talk about that word covenant here in just a minute. The second role of a prophet was to speak on behalf of God, or speak God's truth. Sometimes as they're speaking, they're talking about something God had already said, okay? And then the third role of a prophet was to be set apart. The prophets did some really, especially in the Old Testament, they did some weird things, like some bizarre things to get their point across. So they were set apart. They weren't necessarily like the rest of the culture. But then they were trying to help God's people, the Israelites, be set apart as well. And then the second thing we need to understand before we go through is that we're gonna take a deep dive into history. And we're gonna talk a little bit about Israel's history, because the prophets of the Old Testament give us this framework, but then they also are talking to Israel, God's people. And so we need to understand a little bit more of their story to understand what the prophets are trying to communicate. And we're gonna talk about covenant a lot. And I just want to explain just briefly, this is an overview of what a covenant is. And a covenant is more than just a contract. It's more than just a promise. I would define a covenant as a loving agreement between two parties. And the first covenant with God we see is in Genesis chapter 12. And God is talking to Abraham. And he's going to tell Abraham that through you, Abraham, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to make your descendants numerous. I'm going to give you so much. I'm going to send you, Abraham, to a new land. And then I'm going to bless all of the nations through you. So he makes this beautiful promise, this beautiful covenant with Abraham, that I will do these things for you. And then later, Moses, as a prophet, is going to to expand upon this covenant. He's going to add more specifics to what's happening in that covenant. And what we're going to see is that this covenant, this agreement is going to sound a little bit like this. God is going to say, I'm going to do these things for you, but you need to follow me. You need to do things my way, and you need to do your part of the covenant. And so there's this two-way street that happens with the covenant. Now, if you're spiritually unresolved, maybe you're just here and you don't quite know if you buy into all of this yet, and that's okay. And I just want to say welcome. I'm glad you're here, or if you're joining online, that you'd be willing to join us today and explore. And as we talk about I want to clarify a couple of phrases. The Old Testament, what we're talking about there, the Older Testament, is the account of God's people, who we refer to as the Israelites, who the covenant was made with, and their story, their wandering, their journeying, their ups and their downs. And so the Older Testament is going to tell us all the story of their history, or a good portion of it. And then the New Testament we're going to talk about, and the New Testament is the four Gospels, which are the story of Jesus and his life and his death and his resurrection. And then the New Testament also contains letters and epistles written to the early church after Jesus leaves. And so if you are spiritually unresolved, welcome. I hope that through what we talk about today, that you get a greater understanding of God's heart and his love for you. So let's dive into first Israel's history. So we're going to go all the way back to a time period called the Exodus. It's this story, it's this epic story of the Israelites. And Israel and his sons are going to end up migrating to Egypt because of a famine, okay? There's this massive famine that covers all the land. And one of Israel's sons, Israel was a person, and Israel's son, Joseph, ends up being second in command in Egypt, okay? And only the king of Egypt is higher than him. And so Israel and his sons, they migrate because of the famine. And they're given land there to dwell and to grow and to flourish because the king of Egypt and Joseph, who's second in command, are like, yeah, this is great. Family members, you do your thing. You can live here, do whatever you want, grow, flourish. And then as this happens, as this famine continues, there's nations all around that are coming to Egypt, and they're saying, hey, we need food. We need food to survive. And so you've got nations coming to them saying, hey, we'll buy the food. But then they run out of money. And so then they say, okay, we'll give you our livestock. And then they run out of livestock. And they say, okay, we'll give you our land. And then they run out of land and they say, we'll give you ourselves. Take us. We'll be your servants. We'll be your slaves. Just please give us food. Please don't let us die. And so through the course of this famine, Egypt becomes this massive world power, a dominant force on the world stage. And over the course of time, Joseph, the second in command, who was part of Israel's family, dies. And then the king of Egypt, who was favorable towards Israel, he dies as well. And then the next pharaohs that rise are no longer as big of a fan of Israel, because Israel, the community, the group of people, is growing and they're expanding and they're flourishing. And so Egypt gets worried, Pharaoh gets worried, and so they say, we gotta control this. And so let's enslave them. Let's make them work for us, and they'll do our work for us. And so over the course of several hundred years, Israel, the people, are enslaved to Egypt. And in this time, they would have started to wonder, okay, hold on, what about that promise that God made? What about that covenant? We were supposed to flourish. We were supposed to have our own land. And so the people of Israel are going to start to have an identity crisis because they're in bondage. They're in slavery. And in that culture, it was also considered true that whatever nation was on top, whatever nation was strongest, meant their God was the strongest. And so the Israelite community would have continually been faced with the reinforced narrative that Egypt's gods are greater than Israel's God because they're the dominant power. They have the upper hand. And so the Israelite community is just going to continue to struggle. Who are we and where is God? Is God going to do what he said he would do? So then God is going to raise up a prophet, and this prophet's name is Moses. And through this epic story, through this epic situation, Moses is going to fulfill the role of those three roles of the prophet. He's going to remind Israel, the people of God, of God's covenant with them. Moses is going to speak God's truth. He's going to speak to Pharaoh on behalf of God, but he's also going to speak to Israel on behalf of God and continue to communicate that way. And then third, Moses is going to be set apart, but he's going to invite the people of God to be set apart. And in fact, that's where the major issue begins to happen between Moses and Pharaoh. Because Moses is going to say, hey, we the Israelites, we the people of God, we need to be set apart. We need to be different. We're going to go. Would you let us go to this mountain? Can we go away and can we worship? Because we're different and we've got this different system going on. Would you let us go? And the king of Egypt, Pharaoh, he says, that's not how this works. You don't tell me what to do. I tell you what to do. But then through a series of about 10 contests, there were 10 contests, and God is going to dismantle the Egyptian gods and prove that he is still on the throne, that he is still God. He's going to remind his people of his power, but then he's also going to free the Israelites from the bondage of Egypt. And he's going to set them on a journey to go to the promised land. And there's a lot more to the story, and you can read about it in Exodus, but the Israelite people are free from their enslavement, they're freed from their bondage, and they're going to head to the promised land. And they go to a place called Mount Sinai. And on Mount Sinai, Moses gives the people on behalf of God the 10 commandments. And these 10 commandments are a reminder of their identity. On Mount Sinai, God is going to remind them, you are mine, and this is what it looks like to be my people. And so he's going to restore and remind them of their identity. And then later in Deuteronomy, as they're getting ready to go into the promised land, in Deuteronomy chapter 28, Moses is going to, as a prophet, expand upon the original covenant given to Abraham. And it goes like this. In Deuteronomy chapter 28, Moses says to the Israelites on behalf of God, if you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully follow all his commands I give you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations on earth. All these blessings will come on you and accompany you if you obey the Lord your God. You will be blessed in the city and blessed in the country. The fruit of your womb will be blessed, and the crops of your land, and the young of your livestock, and the calves of your herds, and the lambs of your flocks. Your basket and your kneading trough will be blessed. You will be blessed when you come in, and blessed when you go out. And then later in the chapter, he's going to give the other side of what happens when they don't choose God's way. However, if you do not obey the Lord your God and do not carefully follow all his commands and decrees I am giving you today, all these curses will come on you and overtake you. You will be cursed in the city and cursed in the country. Your basket and your kneading trough will be cursed. The fruit of your womb will be cursed, and the crops of your land and the calves of your herds and the lambs of your flocks. You will be cursed when you come in and cursed when you go out. And so Moses is going to expand upon that original covenant, and he's going to give it more specificity. And then in Deuteronomy 18, right before this, we also see that Moses he knows he's about to die. And he spoke on behalf of God to the Israelite community. And the Israelites were afraid. They had this distinct fear that if they entered into God's presence, that they would die. And so they're nervous. They're like, Moses, when you die, what are we going to do? Who's going to tell us what God says? And so Moses, right before he dies, he sets up with God this prophetic system. And this prophetic system in Deuteronomy 18, he says, God is going to raise up another prophet after me. You must listen to him. And so what we see in this is it's a beautiful picture of prophets being a way for God to communicate to his people. The Israelites continued to ignore and to run and to be ignorant. But what we see in this pattern and this prophetic system that's set up in Deuteronomy 18 is that the God of Israel is a God who wants to be heard, that he's making a way for himself to be heard. And even though even today we are fearful and we ignore him, he still wants to be heard, and he continues to speak to us. So then we're going to fast forward a few hundred years, and I have mostly terrible handwriting, but I put down a little timeline here that's not actually accurate to time, but it is supposed to. So I don't know why I'm calling it a timeline, but it is supposed to give us a picture of these major points. So again, coming back to Abraham, we have the original covenant Genesis 12. And then the Israelites are enslaved. They're in bondage in Egypt. And then there's the Exodus where they leave and they're freed, and God moves them out and sends them to the promised land. And as they're wandering in the desert and as they're out there, God restores and expands upon his covenant with his people. And then there's this period of time, Nate talked about this last week, this period of the judges and the kings, where God continued to raise up prophets to walk alongside the judges and the kings and continue to function in those three roles to call people back to the covenant of God. Come back, remember the covenant you made with God. Remember this agreement that you're in. They would continue to speak God's truth. They would speak on behalf of God, but they'd also remind them, this is what God already said. Remember this. And third, the prophets would continue in this period to say, be set apart. You're not supposed to look like the other nations. You are supposed to be different. But then what we see in the entire even system of the kings in this period is that Israel was ignoring God and walking away from God because they said, hey, we don't want to be led by you. We want a king. We want to look just like all the other nations. So would you give us a king? And throughout this period, we continue to have prophets raised up to function in those roles and to remind them of those three things. And some of the prophets that we see in that period of time would be Samuel, who anoints King Saul and King David. We see Nathan, who confronts David when David has missteps. We see Elijah and we see Elisha. And so there's some prophets throughout the Old Testament that occupy this timeline. And then we get to a period in history where we start to see, and we have the writings of the prophets, the major prophets, which include Isaiah and Jeremiah, and then the minor prophets. And what we see in these writings is that warning after warning, reminder after reminder, Israel continues to wander, continues to ignore, continues to go their own way, and they're given warning after warning after warning. And so finally, God is at a breaking point. God is at a breaking point with Israel, with his covenant. He's saying, hey, listen, we're getting to a point where I can't keep holding off. I need to act. God must act. And so the prophets, and why we have these writings, is because they're documenting, hey, this is what's going to happen, and we want to make sure that it's written down. But their message is, now God must act. So where we find ourselves with Isaiah and Jeremiah and their relationship and what they're trying to communicate with the Israelites, in Peter Gentry, he wrote a book called How to Read and Understand the Biblical Prophets, and he gives this analogy of a parent in a grocery store. And I'm actually going to tell you a personal story because I have one that aligns just so. So a couple of weeks ago, I was in Costco and with my boys. I've got two boys, Harvey, who's almost 7, Cohen, who's almost 3. And so the four of us are going into Costco, and we're walking in. We're walking from the car to the store, and I look at the boys and say, hey, listen, if you don't listen and you don't stay close, you're going to have to ride in the cart, okay? That's how this is going to go today. Okay, Dad, yeah, whatever, yeah, we get it. I was all right. So we go through the entry doors, and not 20 steps in, one of them has completely ran off. So I call him back. Come back here. Hey, what did I say? Stay close and listen, otherwise you're going to have to ride in the cart. And if you've ever seen a parent in a store, or if you've ever been a parent in a store, you know that was not the only time I had to say that. And so I repeated myself, Harvey, get back here. Cohen, get back here. Come on, what did I say? Stay close, listen, or you're going to have to ride in the cart over and over and over again. Finally, we're in the produce section, and Harvey had been climbing on the side of the cart and jumping off, which was driving me nuts, but he kept doing it. And then finally he jumped and he ended up landing right in front of the cart. And I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but I almost clipped his ankles with the front of the cart, and that hurts so bad. It's infuriating, right? And so I stopped the cart. I didn't hit him, but I looked at him. I said, Harvey, what did I say? You need to stay close. You need to listen. Otherwise, you're going to be in the cart. There are no more warnings. That would have hurt so bad. And this is where we find God with Israel. Isaiah and Jeremiah are communicating no more warnings. God has to act. And so their message is clear. Remember God's covenant with you. They're giving an invitation. Come back, turn around, repent. God's going to make a way. He will restore his covenant with you, but you've got to change what you're doing because God must act. There are no more warnings. And then in the truth that they're trying to communicate, a lot of times we think of prophets as telling the future, right? That they're foretelling what's going to happen. And some of that is true. But a lot of what Isaiah and Jeremiah, these prophets, are trying to do is they're just telling you this is what God already said he's going to do. He's already told you what's going to happen. And so Isaiah and Jeremiah and these prophets, they're writing, God is going to act the way he said he was going to. Let's go back to Costco for a second. If there was somebody who had heard me communicate to my boys in this way, and then let's say this person walked up to Harvey and said, hey, Harvey, listen, if you don't get it together, if you don't change, I bet your dad's gonna pick you up, and I bet he's gonna sit you in that cart, and I bet you're gonna be stuck in that cart until they leave Costco. On one hand, that person would be speaking into the future. It has not happened yet. But on the other hand, it's a pretty safe bet. Why? Because I already said I was going to do it. And so the prophets are looking to the future saying, if you don't change, if you don't come back, God is going to act in this way. And one of the beautiful things about this actually is that they're speaking of God's faithfulness. And see, we as people, the Israelites, and we do too, we love the idea of God's faithfulness when it's about him providing for us, or him protecting us, or keeping us safe, or helping us flourish. That's awesome. We love God's faithfulness when it looks like that. But on the other side, and what we see with Israel is the other side of God's faithfulness is God said, if you don't follow me, if you break my covenant, I'm going to act in this way. God's faithfulness is still on display when he keeps the other side of the covenant. He's doing what he said he would do, and so he's still being faithful to his word and to his character. And so in Isaiah and Jeremiah and the other prophets, sometimes it feels like doom and gloom and chaos. But to the original audience, and even for us, if we understand that, it can be this beautiful picture of God being a faithful God who does what he says he will do. And one of the things that they're also trying to reinforce, Isaiah and Jeremiah are trying to reinforce that you're not here. Let's go back to Egypt. That cultural understanding of whoever's nation was greater meant their gods were greater. So Israel is on the verge, in the prophets, there's a lot of history covered. So in these writings, they're either on the verge of being conquered, they are conquered and in exile, or they're lamenting the exile and working through how to come back. And so the prophets are saying, listen, you're not in this predicament. You're not in this situation because these other nations and gods are greater. You're not here because Babylon is greater. You're not here because Assyria is greater. You're not here because their gods are more substantial and more powerful. You are here because you broke God's covenant. And so it's a reminder that God is still in control, and he can work nations, he can work situations to reflect what he wants. And so in Isaiah and Jeremiah's writings, they're reminding Israel of the truth that God said he would do, and they're speaking that to them. And then finally, the third thing in their prophetic role of being set apart is Isaiah and Jeremiah are going to speak of a new way for Israel to be set apart. There's going to be a new way for them to come home. God's going to make a way, which means there's hope. So as what we see in this is Isaiah and Jeremiah are going to continually point back in their writings, and they're going to point back to the covenant. Remember God's covenant with you. Come back to God's covenant with you. Turn back and follow God. And then they're going to do something in their writings that's going to use the Exodus account as a picture of this new way to come home. And this is called a typology. What they're going to do is they're going to take this story, this familiar account of their history, and they're going to say, God's going God's going to make a new exodus. There's going to be a new exodus in the future that even though you are conquered, even though you're about to be conquered, even though you will be in exile, God's going to give you a new exodus. Let's look to the future. In God's covenant, he always said, after you disobey, after you turn away, I will make a way for you to come back. When you turn back to me, I will make a way. So Isaiah and Jeremiah, they're going to look to the Exodus as a way to give hope for there will be a new way to come home. We see in Isaiah chapter 27, he says it this way, and in that day, a great trumpet will sound. Those who were perishing in Assyria and those who were exiled in Egypt will come and worship the Lord on the holy mountain in Jerusalem. So he's saying, hey, just like in Egypt when you were enslaved, God's going to bring you home to Jerusalem. He's going to bring a way back. They're using this as imagery to say there's going to be a new way to come home. And then in Jeremiah 16, however, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when it will no longer be said, as surely as the Lord lives, who brought the Israelites up out of Egypt, but it will be said, as surely as the Lord lives, who brought the Israelites up out of the land of the north and out of all the countries where he had banished them. For I will restore them to the land I gave their ancestors. So they're using this account of Exodus to say there's going to be a new one. There's going to be a new way to come out of exile. There's going to be a new way to come home. And what they're doing is they're pointing to the person of Jesus. They're using this reference to say, there will be one, there will be a way, and his name is Jesus. So we're going to fast forward now a few hundred years to the Sermon on the Mount. This is the first sermon that Jesus gives. And in Matthew chapter 5, verses 17, he says this, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. And so Jesus is communicating to his audience, to those who are listening, I am going to start something new. And then through the rest of his Sermon on the Mount, through this message, he's going to communicate what this kingdom, this new kingdom that's going to be established, looks like. And he's going to communicate who it's for. And it's this upside down, countercultural way of living. And Jesus was familiar with the prophets. He knew the prophets. In fact, in Luke, we hear of Jesus opening the scroll of Isaiah, and Jesus, knowing this, confirms who he is when he reads the scroll of Isaiah and says that he will proclaim good news to the poor and set free those who are oppressed. And so Jesus is trying to communicate, hey, listen, I know what the prophet said. I know they were talking about this new way to come home, and I am that way. Jesus begins to function as a prophet. And he was more than a prophet. That's not all he was, but he functions as a prophet. Because he's going to function in that he's going to remind people of the covenant of God. He's going to speak God's truth. And he's going to invite people to be set apart. The prophets were calling people back to the way of God, but Jesus says, I am the way. The prophets were speaking the truth of God, and Jesus says, I am the truth. I am the embodiment of the faithfulness that the prophets were talking about. When they looked forward and said, God will be faithful to make a way, that was talking about me. I'm initiating this. I am the embodiment of that faithfulness. The prophets were inviting God's people to be set apart, and Jesus said, I am the life lived, set apart. Come, follow me. And what's beautiful is that it didn't stop there. As Jesus began this movement, it didn't just stay in that point in history, and it wasn't just him. It wasn't just about this temporary kingdom or just a point in time or even just a location. In classic Jesus fashion, he transcends and he raises the bar and he makes it about all people. It's no longer just for the Israelites. This is for all people. This is for all men, and this is for all time. Jesus is initiating something that says, I'm going to make a way forever for exiles to come home. And he invites the disciples to be a part of it. He looks at people and he says, hey, you guys, come follow me. Let's go do this together. Let's go find the exiles. Let's go find those who are wandering, who are broken, who are in slavery, who are in bondage, and let's bring them home. And then in Matthew 28, what we would call the Great Commission. What does Jesus say to his disciples? He says, go into all the world. Tell them about the good news. Make disciples of all nations. Tell them about my faithfulness. Tell them about who I am. Go find the exiles and bring them home. Jesus is the new covenant. He has a new promise. This is a new home, and it's this kingdom of God where we are invited, and he initiated this new way to be set apart. And so today, I want to say that we can partner with Jesus. We can call people back home. That if we believe this, that if we are followers of Jesus, that part of our job to function in the prophetic is we are supposed to call people back home. We are supposed to go find the exiles, those who are broken, those who are in bondage, those who are in slavery, and say, it doesn't have to be like this. Come home. God has made a way. We can point to God's truth. We can point to his faithfulness in the person of Jesus. In 1 Corinthians 14, Paul's talking to the early church in Corinth, and he's talking about spiritual gifts, which is a whole nother conversation for another time. But when Paul is talking about prophets and how to prophesy, Paul says this, that when you prophesy, your words should strengthen, encourage, and comfort. And so as we speak of God's faithfulness, as we speak of the truth that he's already communicated, we can prophesy in a way that strengthens, encourages, and comforts. And then finally, we can be set apart. That this way that Jesus invites us into, it is countercultural, it is different. But we are invited to be set apart and to look different. And so a few questions for you as we wrap up. Number one would be, how can you partner with Jesus to call people out of exile and to come home? How can you partner with Jesus? Number two, how can you create a rhythm of remembering God's truth and his faithfulness? I don't know about you, but I am just like the Israelites. I forget, and I wander. But how could we begin to create a rhythm of remembering God's truth and his faithfulness? Number three, is there an area of our lives where we are doing things our way instead of his? And then how do we need to become set apart again?